This is Dan Schneider on this Dan Schneider video interview. It is the final of my trilogy on the idea of nothingness. Philosopher Nicholas Waghorn is my guest, and the conversation will begin when we return. Philosopher Nicholas Waghorn from Oxford University is my guest, and he is my final of three guests who will be talking or who have talked about the idea of nothingness. And so talking from it from a philosophical perspective, though, I will give Nicholas, though, a few minutes to give a little background about himself. So Nicholas, welcome. And if you could tell me a little bit about yourself biographically, how anything you may have written or done on the idea of nothingness and so forth.
Yes, sure. Thanks very much for having me on and being interested to talk to me. So I did my undergraduate degree at Oxford University at a little college called Regent's Park College, where I studied philosophy and theology, and that increased my interest, already nascent in philosophy, further to the point where I wanted to take my studies to a more deep and more intense degree. So I carried on and did my PhD the next city over, the University of Reading, under a supervisor called John Cottingham, who may be known to people who are interested in philosophy as one of the world experts on Descartes. He's also written on philosophy of religion. And at that point, he was working on issues to do with the meaning of life, which is another area that I was quite interested in. So my thesis was on the relationship between the concept of nothing and the notion of the meaning of life. I thought that maybe there was some interesting relation between that metaphysical idea of nothing and this ethical issue. People often put the meaning of life under the issue or under the heading of ethics. So I wanted to explore the relationships between those two. That's what I did for my PhD. And then a revised version of my PhD thesis, sort of considerably expanded and updated, was turned into a monograph. So that was published in 2014. And that's called Nothingness and the Meaning of Life. So that came out with Bloomsbury. More famous, I think, Bloomsbury for doing the Harry Potter books, but I'm not sure my book's quite up there with the sales for that at the moment. So then I got a job in Oxford. I did some teaching for various colleges, but then I was recruited by St Benet's Hall, University of Oxford, which is one of the permanent private halls of Oxford. They've had some illustrious philosophers there. One of my philosophical forebears, I think, was Sir Anthony Kenny. Also another writer on Descartes and on philosophy of religion, amongst many other things. And I also became a director of studies in philosophy at Blackfriars Hall, which is another of the constituent halls of the University of Oxford. So I'm fellow in philosophy at St Benet's and director of studies in philosophy at Blackfriars Hall now, and have been for the past nearly a decade now.
Well, let me pick up on the idea of meaning and nothingness, because and I'll get to what nothingness is in a moment or two, but is nothingness really something that can bring meaning, i.e. that if there is nothing, then there is nothing, whereas if something has to exist, then you can have meaning with something. So is nothingness more or less a precondition rather than something that can give meaning?
When you say precondition, could you say a little bit more about what you mean by that?
Well, you can't have meaning if there is nothing. You have to have something. Whereas nothingness, I guess you could argue that nothingness and somethingness are opposites or whatnot, but I don't know if that's necessarily so.
Well, it's a good point. So, I mean, I think the deepest questions with regard to nothing are just, what on earth is it? How are we to understand the concept? So I think in terms of the issues of nothingness or nothing that are current in contemporary philosophical debate, at least within analytic philosophy, the style of philosophy that's predominantly practiced in the US and in the UK, I think there are three sorts of areas in which nothing crops up as a central idea. And then the first of those is this question, look, why is there something rather than nothing? And then there's the question, could there have been nothing at all? Yeah. And then there's the question, what is nothing?
Yeah.
And I think that's the deepest question, this question about what is nothing. I think it's the deepest question. I think in some ways it's the hardest question. And it may also be the most intractable question. So when you talk about, well, look, are nothing and something opposites? Intuitively, that's what we want to say.
Yeah.
The problem is that when we're working with these very fundamental concepts like nothing, something, or everything, we have, if you like, moved so far away from the ordinary concepts that we use our everyday language to talk about, that it seems that our language, the intuitions that are, if you like, enshrined in our language, that enable us to get a conceptual grip on things, that language is being used outside of the sphere that it normally is used in. It might be a case of what Wittgenstein described as language going on holiday.
Yeah.
And so it becomes very hard to try to work out what sorts of understanding you're going to have of these very fundamental concepts. Now, to link that back, because I don't want to sort of avoid talking about your central question, though, about its relationship to meaning, I think what you say is very interesting, right? This idea that, look, if there just is nothing, how can there be any meaning?
Yeah.
And I'm quite sympathetic to that. So my interest was in, if you like, the ultimate meaning of life. So philosophers have sometimes made a distinction in the meaning of life, the debates between the meaning of life and meaning in life.
Yeah.
And the meaning in life debate. So probably the most well-known and comprehensive book that's been released recently is a book called Meaning in Life by a very good philosopher called Thaddeus Metz. And he talks about various ways in which one's life might get more or less meaning. And that's what it seems to be the meaning in life debate has been about. How do we enable our lives to have more meaning? Or what would it mean for our lives to have more meaning? Or what would it take? I was interested in, although I think that's a very interesting debate, my interest was, could we get a kind of level of meaning which it would be impossible to improve upon? Mm-hmm. So again, we've got a kind of limit concept there, the ultimate meaning of life. And I think when you're looking for something like that, you're going to have to approach other limit concepts to try to find an answer to it. So I think you're right that when we talk about our everyday workaday notions of what might make our lives slightly more or slightly less meaningful, we are going to have to talk about something, particularly something specific, like this or that thing described in certain ways. My interest, the reason why I brought nothing in was because when I felt we wanted to kind of push through that, if that debate even makes sense, to what might be the ultimate meaning of life, we might need to make use of these commensurately more ultimate concepts.
Yeah. Well, I think it'll be fruitful to spend a good portion of this interview talking about meaning, since this was not something that in the other two interviews I pursued as much. But before I do that, just to give a cognate to someone who's just stumbled across this 5 or 10 years from now, I guess what I meant by nothingness versus somethingness being opposites or not is that, just to use a familiar concept of morality, what is the opposite of morality? Is it immorality or amorality, being outside the concept? So is nothingness outside the concept of somethingness in a way? And if so, whether the cognate for nothingness is amorality or immorality, what is the other equivalent there? And I don't think even in the West, or even that I know of, and you may probably know more than I do, is there even something that is a third alternative between nothingness and somethingness in any kind of rational way?
Not to my awareness. I think maybe what you might say completes the kind of tripartite distinction might be that something becomes the middle ground and the opposite might be everything. So you might have might say that nothingness is nothing is the opposite of everything, and something is this kind of middle ground. If you were to try to set it up like that, so maybe that might be one way of doing it. But between nothing and something, I'm not sure that there's anything. You do get these slightly odd-sounding and slightly kind of Lewis Carroll-style sentences when you start talking about these things. So I apologise for saying anything between nothing and something. But yeah, I mean, because those are the three concepts that interest me. I mean, they seem to be in certain ways interdefinable: everything, something, and nothing. And so maybe that's the kind of third aspect to it that you're thinking of, or I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah. Well, yeah. No, that's an interesting thing, because everything would be 100%. Nothing is 0%, or even off the scale, and then something is somewhere between an infinitesimal and a near infinite percentage of that. But let me just turn, before I get back to some of the other things that you had mentioned, because there's a lot to unpack there. You had mentioned earlier, and I did touch on this with the two other people I interviewed. I believe, and I could be wrong, but that human beings have a fundamental problem with large concepts. For example, if we go back to geology, people like Lyell and Hutton, the idea of deep time, something beyond Bishop Ussher's 6,000-year-old Earth, the idea that the Earth could be millions, or that the cosmos could be billions, or perhaps infinitely old, is just beyond that concept. And I'm wondering if nothingness is beyond the human ken. Because when we think of nothing generally, and when I use a little graphic for these videos, it'll probably be something like blackness. But blackness is a nothingness. Blackness is blackness. Silence is not nothingness. It is silence. The concept of zero is still zero. It's null. It's nothing, or idealized as nothing. But it is also something between negative and positive integers. So,
yes.
do human beings, as things that exist, do we have a fundamental genetic congenital flaw in even being able to grasp nothingness?
Yeah, I mean, it may even be something more powerful than a kind of biological inbuilt. So I talked about, our language, and how, our language might have come about so that we talk about these fairly practical things, and it becomes harder to talk about things which are beyond us. You could give a kind of evolutionary explanation of that, but it could be that there's if you like, a stronger inability. So this is something that one might associate very much with the philosopher Immanuel Kant,
Yeah.
who believed that there were conditions, what he called the categories, that applied to any possible experience, so that it was an experience for us. And nothing that was a human being could sort of shed those categories in understanding any possible experience. So, things like cause and effect. I mean, I think he derived the categories from Aristotle, and there's some debate as to whether he took these up too uncritically. I think Hegel maybe takes him to task for this a bit, but the central idea is that we have certain ways of understanding the world which we can't get outside of. And so there are these, whatever reality is as it is in itself is in some ways inaccessible to us. And the more that you want to try to dispense with these categories, these ways of understanding the world, and it may be that part of our way of understanding the world is to think of things as things and not as nothing. These categories, whatever they are, do, if you like, ascribe certain characteristics to things. But we don't want to ascribe certain characteristics to nothing, or at least intuitively, because nothing just doesn't have any characteristics.
Yeah. One could say its characteristics is non-characteristic. I mean, there is nothing to define it.
Yeah, I mean, then you get into, so this is where, you have this kind of paradox. So Kant talked about the noumenal realm as something that was kind of beyond our ken, and we couldn't apply our categories to it. And one sort of attractive criticism of Kant, which may be simplistic, but for our purposes here might be interesting, is to say, well, how can you talk about this as being a realm? Kant wanted to talk about the noumenal realm as being populated by things in themselves. How can you talk about things as opposed to a thing in itself? How can you divide it up into these different things? So Kant wanted to kind of push this kind of reality outside our categories, but in doing so, he tried to think what could be thought. And when we try to do that about nothing and say its characteristic is that it has no characteristics, that's a contradiction. And so maybe this is what makes that question, as I said at the beginning, the question, what is nothing, so difficult? And this is why some philosophers have just wanted to try and do away with the notion of nothing.
Yeah.
So Heidegger famously talks about nothing, and he might not be talking about nothing in the same way that you and I are currently talking about nothing. Maybe he's doing something different with that. But Carnap, in a famous article, The Elimination of Metaphysics, it's just a short title, wanted to do away with our talk about nothing, and he thought we could do this by analysing the proper structure of sentences. He thought when we analysed the structure of a sentence like there's nothing in the fridge, we would see that the word nothing drops out, and so there's nothing to talk about.
Yeah.
So when we say there's nothing in the fridge, we mean to say it's not the case that there is anything such that thing is in the fridge.
Yeah.
So philosophers have been a bit sort of leery. Philosophers are terribly leery about trying to, but it's very interesting, this idea about trying to cross the limit and go beyond the limits of thought. But it's very hard to actually avoid doing that. It seems to kind of crop up in all sorts of other areas, like when you try and push a bump down under a carpet and it pops up somewhere else.
Yeah, probably the best way that I have tried to think of what nothingness, that I could conceive of it, is, and I've done some shows on people who believe that there's life after death, or that there's an existence beyond. And I always say the only way I can conceive of nothing is, I was born in 1965, February 2nd, so in a month or so, a few weeks, I'm going to be 53. And I can say, well, if I try to remember 1945, or I try to remember 1066, or I try to remember, the Mongol invasions, I wasn't there. I can read about it. I can recreate the Mongol hordes coming across the steppes. I can recreate, Columbus sailing the ocean blue. But if I think of 1969, when I was 4 years old, I have some vague memories. I can remember being in high school in the early 80s. I can remember this job in 2002, or when someone rear-ended me in a car in 05 or something. But there is that limit, that you go back to the end point of you, or the beginning point of your life, that zero, and that's the big bang of you. And before that, everything is just things that you've been told. When you think, let me just ask you personally, as a person rather than a philosopher, and then you can opine philosophically, do you sometimes, is that the closest you can get to an idea of nothing, before you were born?
So you say you were going to ask me as a person rather than a philosopher. Yes, I think there are all sorts of attractive or some attractive ideas there, as to say, well, what is it like to think of nothing? And I try and think about this in an everyday way. As an everyday person, I probably don't think of nothing much at all.
Yeah.
I think of the nothing in my fridge or the nothing in my wallets and get sort of a bit sad about it. But I don't think necessarily of nothing in this grand scale. And maybe the closest I would come would be this idea of yours of the nothing that it was like before we were born, there being nothing it was like to be me before I was born. But as a philosopher, I would want to subsequently go on to problematize that. So shall I go on to talk about this as a philosopher?
Go ahead, yes, please.
Yeah, so it's terribly interesting actually what you say about this idea of the nothing before I was born, because hopefully my next project will be to go on to write a book about death, using and applying some of these ideas about nothing. So death as a kind of phenomenological nothing. There's nothing it's like to be me when I'm dead, right? And all I am, if you like, on some views of what a person is that there is something it's like to be me, right? That's just certain views. So yes, Philip Larkin in his poem Or Bard spoke about death, and he said the mind blanks at the glare. This idea that when you try to think about what death might be like, you might try to think about what it was like before I was born. And we talk about, well, what would it be like to be, for nothing to exist, or what is nothing like? Now, the problem here might be that if nothing genuinely has no characteristics, there's nothing that it's like to be nothing. And so that's why these kind of attractive ideas that might seem to lead us up to nothing might not be able to play the role we want them to play. So we might think that as we get rid of bits of the universe, we're getting closer to the idea that there is nothing. And this relies on the idea that when you get rid of a bit of the universe, another bit of the universe doesn't pop up in its place. And the latter is what Henri Bergson, the French philosopher, thought. He thought when you eliminated something, at least mentally, something else took its place, some arena for it to be in. So if I eliminate the things in my fridge, something pops into place to replace the things in my fridge, namely some more empty space, which, although it's not much, is still not nothing. So it might be quite hard to work out how we even go about approaching nothing, because nothing is, it seems, qualitatively different even from the minor nothings that we think about in our everyday life. And that might be further grist to the mill of the idea that actually when we're trying to talk about this very limiting concept, we don't even know what we mean by a limit concept, because we can't see how we could lead up to it. It just becomes completely radically different, and so maybe nothing isn't the right word for it.
Yeah, well, let me, if I could, just for a moment. I just wanted to follow up on something that you said, and give a point of view that I have gotten from a number of scientists, and see what you as a philosopher think of it. For a scientist, for example, when they talk of, say, an empty vacuum, they will say that there's still potential energy, and some scientists would say that the universe sums to nothing, meaning that if you took all the antimatter and matter, it would cancel each other out. If you took all of the electrical charges, positive and negative, in the universe, it equals absolute zero and whatnot. But to me, that always seems a weasel way out of the thing, because we do have the positive and the electric, and they may indeed add up to zero, but is zero nothing? What is your take on that kind of physical, as in physicist, a physical approach to nothingness?
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree with you on that one. It certainly seems to me that if two things sum to zero, that doesn't mean that you've got no things there.
Yeah.
So if you dig a hole and you've got a pile of dirt and a big hole, and you put the pile of dirt into the hole and there's no hole and no pile of dirt, that doesn't mean that when you dig the hole and you've got your pile of dirt and your hole, that those two things don't exist.
Yeah.
They still exist. So I'm not too sure about these. I mean, I think that these moves, although hey, it might be perfectly true that the energy of the universe, the positive and the negative energy, do sum to zero, which is an interesting scientific fact. What I wouldn't do then is to try to draw some kind of philosophical fact from it to the effect that nothing exists, so we don't need to explain why there's something rather than nothing because there's nothing now. Or, if we have an empty vacuum or a vacuum which has some kind of energy associated with it, or if we have empty space, then actually we've got nothing there. That's not what I think most philosophers are talking about, even historically, when they talk about nothing. So yeah, I think that sometimes there's this temptation to draw these kind of headline-grabbing philosophical points from perfectly good and valuable scientific work, but that's, to my mind, perhaps when people are trying to think outside of their normal sphere of academic expertise. If that doesn't sound too kind of parochial.
Yeah, well, you also have a degree, and you'd mentioned theology before. And let me just try to scope out maybe the difference, because I just mentioned science, some of the philosophical or critical differences between a theologic and a philosophical approach to nothing. And I'm thinking that generally people, or if you look at the beginning of the Bible, there was a void, there was nothingness, and then God created the universe over 6 days or whatnot. But of course, that brings up the question then, if God exists, then God is not nothing, God is everything, so how could God create nothing? And I'm just wondering, since you studied both, do you have more truck with one or the other? Do you think that the philosophical ideas, say, about nothingness evolved because of inadequacies in a theological idea of nothing?
It's a tricky question. I think that the philosophy about nothing has probably been being done in an implicit or an explicit way as long as people have been thinking, in the same way that I think theological approaches to the issue have been done for as long as people have been thinking. So I'm not sure that one kind of evolved as a response to the other. I think maybe they co-evolved in dialectic with one another. So certainly you have even some of the very earliest philosophy in the pre-Socratics, Parmenides talks or involves himself in thinking about the concepts of being and nothing, although largely in order to eschew the notion of nothing. So with the theistic idea, it's kind of current, or theism is kind of current in questions of why is there something rather than nothing, and could there have been nothing? So typically the theist will want to say, well, not all theists, I'm being painting with too broad a brush here, but many theists will want to say it's not the case that there could have been nothing, because God is something and God necessarily exists. So if anything exists necessarily, if there's some one thing that exists necessarily, then it's not possible that there could have been nothing at all.
Yeah.
And so they've usually tried to justify this with some form of the ontological argument, maybe. Not all theists have wanted to say that. So some theists think it's possible that there could have been nothing, and they don't think that God necessarily existed. So my colleague at Oxford, he's the emeritus professor of philosophy of religion, now Richard Swinburne, doesn't think that God necessarily existed.
And I interviewed Richard Swinburne a year or two ago. So.
Oh, great. Okay.
But go on.
Sorry.
No, go on. I'm sorry I interrupted you. I just wanted to plug him.
Oh, right. Yeah, no, great. Yes, so I mean, he doesn't think that God exists in every possible world. I mean, that's the way that philosophers sometimes talk about things necessarily existing, if they exist in every possible world, where a possible world is just a description of the way the world might be, or a way the world might have been. There are different kind of metaphysics for what possible worlds are, but don't worry about that at the moment. So the theist is going to want to say, well, so theism might not necessarily be incompatible with the idea that there might have been nothing, but certain versions of theism will be. So versions of theism which say that God is a necessary being. So as I said, there's this question that's becoming quite popular in philosophy now, which is a question about a doctrine called metaphysical nihilism. And metaphysical nihilism is just the view that there might have been nothing. So if you're a metaphysical nihilist, you believe there might have been nothing. You don't believe that there's actually nothing necessarily, not unless you're kind of got some very crazy views. But if you are a theist who believes that God existed necessarily, or God exists necessarily, then you're going to want to say that metaphysical nihilism is false. So it does. Theism is still quite pertinent to the current debates about nothing in philosophy as a kind of the metaphysics more generally. And I'm not sure I'd necessarily say that philosophical conceptions of nothing brought out to show inadequacies in the theistic view. There may be alternatives or, other ways of looking at the picture. So obviously, some of these philosophers will disagree with theism. So if you're a metaphysical nihilist, you'll just say, well, God can't be a necessary being. But that doesn't necessarily bring you into conflict with theism as, say, Richard Swinburne might understand it.
I want to return to earlier when we had mentioned, or you had mentioned, the ideas of meaning related to nothingness. And personally, on a personal level, and I come from an artistic perspective. I not only don't think that there is any innate meaning in existence, but I find it hard to conceive that there could be. I mean, okay, let's say if we're a computer hologram, well, someone has to program us. Well, that doesn't affect my day-to-day life. It doesn't mean that I don't have to pay my taxes. And whether I'm just the product of some alien that's punching in computer code or a God. It doesn't particularly matter to me. It seems to me that as seemingly, if we want to trust our own senses, that we are intellectual, creative, thinking beings, that in our life, one of the great powers, if not the only real power we have, is to bring meaning or not to our life. That there is no meaning, that meaning comes from us, and we construct our existence about it. Now, I'm wondering, with the concept of nothing, is nothingness perhaps a tool that has been culturally wrought to help us in that quest?
That's a very interesting thought. So the idea is that, if you like, a certain dose or a certain amount of nothingness, sort of localized elements of nothingness, might give us the liberty to construct meaning. Is that maybe the sort of idea you're going for, or have I misunderstood you?
Well, yeah, to a certain degree, but I mean, go on with your point, and we'll tease it out.
Yeah, well, I mean, I suppose so. Here's a kind of an arguable problem with certain ideas about meaning being imposed upon us, right? So some people will want to say, no, there is real meaning in the world, and it's kind of objective, and we just have to find out what it is, right? And you might not like that, right? Because you might just think, well, this is a kind of alien meaning that's being imposed upon me. And this is something that some atheist thinkers have wanted to say worries them a little bit about theistic ideas, for example. I mean, there are other ways of understanding meaning as being objective, but the theistic framework might be helpful for our exposition here. So, if God just says, here are the meanings, I'm going to impose them on you, and this is what it is for life to be meaningful, is that in a certain sense degrading for us? So, if you were of a kind of existentialist mindset, you might say that, well, to take up these meanings for ourselves is going to be a certain degree of living in bad faith, and actually we want to create our own meanings, right? So there might be a parallel with the idea of morality, right? So Kant famously said that we need to legislate morality for ourselves, and we shouldn't submit ourselves to the instructions of another. Otherwise, we're not being properly autonomous in our moral lives. And maybe you might say the same thing about meaning. Yeah, you could say that it's important to a certain degree that we have some liberty to decide what our meaning is. A colleague of mine at Oxford, Tim Mawson, has written a very interesting book relating to some of these ideas called God and the Meanings of Life, where he talks about this idea. I think he might even call it Sartrean meaning of kind of creating meaning for ourselves. He says it's one important strand of what meaningfulness might be. But maybe you could still make room for it on theism by, God not necessarily micromanaging everything. God might leave things up to us to discover what our own meaning is. So I think that it may be the case that, certain types of our not being directed by some kind of objective facts might give us some more meaning. Whether we will be able to attain ultimate meaning off our own bat, as it were, through just kind of trying to decide what's meaningful or not, I'm probably more skeptical about. So I think it's this idea of getting more meaning through our own creative endeavours. Yes, I think you can get more meaning that way. Is it ever going to be enough? Well, I suppose it depends on your point of view. Are you taking the point of view of the kind of point of view of the universe, as it were, or just the point of view of getting through the day? If it's getting through the day, then maybe on a day-to-day basis it might be enough. But maybe at other times you will kind of look back on your life as a whole and sort of wonder, well, if it's all going to end in the universe going into a big freeze, and maximum entropy being created, is there really any ultimate point to it? So I think that there's two questions there, and I guess maybe that sort of slightly rambly response might give you an idea of how I would see those two questions being answered.
Well, I was thinking as you were talking, a theist, I would think, may argue that God created something out of nothing as a way for God to find meaning. But if we think of the Christian gods being all powerful and all knowing, that would not make sense, because why would God have to create this Punch and Judy show that we call existence just to watch us little microbes scurrying around, worrying about how do I pay my mortgage? Does that woman think I'm attractive? Should I go to the pub, or should I go home and work on that sonnet that I want to write? There's an almost absurd level that why, if there is some singular divine being that's all powerful, that something would have to have been created for some reason to answer some kind of question that this God has, unless the God is somehow just a sadist and wants to watch us suffer.
Well, so you're right. I mean, most traditional theists are probably going to want to say that God didn't need to create the world, that God was free not to create or not to create. And there's quite a lot of debate in philosophy of religion about this idea, inaugurated by a book by William Rowe. Well, not inaugurated, but sort of recatalyzed by this book by William Rowe, Can God Be Free? And there's been quite a lot of work done on that now. But most theists have wanted to say that, or most classical theists have wanted to say that God has the property of aseity, which means that God doesn't need to rely on anything else. So God doesn't have any desires which are unfulfilled. That would be sort of unfitting of a divine being. But it's interesting what you say about, well, maybe God created this for pure sadism, because the response, I think, or one response that has been popular to this is that God creates for the opposite reason, out of kind of supererogatory love, or just kind of beneficence. God doesn't need to create, but creates because it just happens to be a good thing to do. Whether that means that God's necessitated to create is the tricky question. And I suppose whether you think that God is being sadistic or God is being kind of beneficent depends on your view of what life is like now and what you think about things like the problem of evil. I mean, I imagine you've probably done some interviews on those sorts of questions. So I won't go into them too much because I don't want to kind of lead us down the garden path. But yeah, I mean, there are kind of interesting questions about why God might create and might not create.
Well, I had earlier mentioned nothingness in the sense of being before one was created, before one was born, before one had consciousness. You've written about death, so that's the other end of the spectrum. And I'm wondering, too, if the idea of nothingness and the prospect, because if we're two cavemen like that Otzi the caveman that was found in Switzerland 5,000-6,000 years ago, and we're a hunter-gatherer tribe, and we're trying to get across the hill to escape the tribesmen from the other, and we've seen many Otzis on the road. We've seen dead people, and we've seen the decay, and they become bones, and the hawks pick at them, and the ants get them, and then they dissolve into the soil. That would seem to me, to a primitive mind, to be a very depressing end. So we're thinking, okay, all we do is become dirt. Does the concept of nothing, how interrelated is that, do you think, with the death fixation, or whatever you might want to call that in human mindset? Is nothing a product of it? Is nothing ancillary to it? Is nothing an answer to it, do you think?
I mean, yes, it is. I mean, it is depressing, isn't it? This idea that all that I love and all that I'm interested in, and all my memories and so forth, are ultimately going to be part of this kind of disintegrating heap of cells. I suppose that maybe this. Well, so nothing is as we kind of with our difficulties in trying to even understand the concept, is this kind of very mysterious because limiting concept, or because it's a concept at the limit. It's very hard to kind of get a grasp on how we should actually understand it. And maybe that is paired with the mystery of death and what happens beyond death, right? So a typical response is that, well, what is it like to be dead? Well, there's nothing it's like to be dead because there's nothing there, right?
Yeah. Well,
However,
it's like when someone says, "What do you think death feels like?" You say, "I don't know because I'm not there." You can't know.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, you don't exist, right?
Yeah.
Now, not everyone has thought that death is the end, right?
Yeah.
As you say, you've talked to people who have talked about life after death. When philosophers talk about whether death is the end, they tend to not necessarily consider it on such empirical grounds. Someone like Derek Parfit thought that empirical grounds were the only reasons for believing in this. But, there are still a kind of handful of philosophers who have argued for something like substance dualism or something like that. A theory which might say that when we die, if we consider death to be a kind of breakdown of our biological structure, that doesn't necessarily mean that we go out of existence. So it depends on how you define death. You could define death as just the irreversible breakdown of our biological bodies, or you could define death as just me going out of existence. And if you don't think that you're the same as your biological body, right, you might, that might be one metaphysical view you might take, then you could differentiate between the two. And in that case, maybe what's after death isn't just non-existence. I don't feel like I'm really kind of getting to grips with the question you asked. I suppose if you're asking what's the relationship between the horror of death and nothing, it seems that what's good about life is all the somethings in it. What's good about my life is that, well, there's going to be a few somethings in there in the future which I'm going to quite enjoy. So maybe the dinner that I'm going to have tonight, or the film I'm going to watch tomorrow. Those are both somethings that I'm going to enjoy. Maybe if your life is filled with lots of horrible somethings, then nothingness seems to be less of a terror if we associate death with that. So you might say that this is why for some people suicide has been seen as a kind of way out. That raises a lot of questions in applied ethics, but maybe that's a way in which we can understand the relationship between nothing and death. It depends on the somethings that are going to happen in the future as to whether the nothingness of death is viewed with horror or not.
Well, let me go to a couple more concepts, and then I'll sort of start wrapping things up and let you talk about anything I may have not brought up that you'd want to speak of. But one of the things regarding nothingness seems to be fundamentally attached to consciousness, or the perception of things. For example, I've often talked with people and I say, well, there's a difference between life and existence. A rock exists, but it's not alive. We could argue whether you or I are delusional in thinking that we are existent beings, extant creatures, but a rock, as far as we know, has no conception that it is a rock, that it is anything. And so it goes to the, if a tree falls in a forest kind of idea, is something, and consequently nothing, intimately tied with our knowledge that cogito ergo sum,
Right. I mean, it's certainly true. So Descartes' cogito it certainly would show that something exists, and so would falsify the claim that nothing exists. In a sense,
but from from the perspective, if it could have a perspective of a piece of quartz, it's immaterial. It doesn't matter because the quartz can't know anything.
When you say it doesn't matter, sorry.
Well, it couldn't matter because a quartz can't even conceive of an idea of something mattering or not. It's a piece of quartz. So from the quartz's perspective, it doesn't even know that it exists in a cosmos, that we can know, oh, there's that pink little piece of quartz. The quartz has no idea that you and I are ogling it.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be the case that these questions only become issues for beings which are capable of entertaining them.
Yeah.
So even for animals, right? Perhaps the lower animals course, these questions aren't going to become salient to them.
Yeah.
The questions become salient to us because we are sufficiently cognitively sophisticated to be able to thematize these very abstract ideas. And, there might be good reasons, evolutionary or otherwise, for why we've become sufficiently cognitively sophisticated to do that. So in a certain sense, getting the idea of nothing is a very useful one from an evolutionary point of view, right? Getting the idea that there is nothing, you'd be able to infer that there's nothing in a certain place means that we can more effectively search for important things to us. So I think if as long as we believe that sort of more advanced cognitive capacities are enabling us to find the truth about things, then it's going to be the case that we're going to feel that these are problems which would be live for the piece of quartz if the piece of quartz could think. The piece of quartz is in a kind of fortunate position, if you like, because it's not going to suffer from these questions about nothing or existential angst, But
it'll never say, "Oh my God, I could have been a diamond."
Yeah, exactly, right. So it doesn't have this idea that it is kind of negated from a more perfect state.
Yeah.
So in the same way, animals are never going to suffer from the fear of death, or at least the lower animals. Probably maybe some of the more
elephants and whales, some of the great apes perhaps have ideas of it that, from what I've read.
Yes, I mean it's hard to know what to draw from the literature. There's a principle called Lloyd Morgan's canon, which says that we should never attribute to animals more sophisticated cognitive processes that are required to explain their behaviour. But you might say that their behaviour is sufficiently complex, or from observing the behaviour, it's seems to indicate the relevant ability in a way that can't be explained any other way.
But certainly couldn't a higher power than us, whether it's a god, an alien, or an artificial intelligence, look at us and say, well, those humans, those pieces of simplistic meat, think they're the shit, but all they're doing is eating, farting, and fucking around. They're not thinking about and doing great things like our civilization is.
Yeah, I mean, so and this maybe once again brings us back to Kant. So maybe there could be other ways of understanding reality, which those beings aren't burdened with, or which those beings have, and so they're not burdened with our categories, which give them a kind of different viewpoint. Whether we could even understand such beings is another matter. So we might think that there are these beings out there which are like that, but whether that scenario actually makes sense, because we can only make sense of beings in accordance with our own categories, will depend on certain ideas and perhaps the philosophy of language or similar. So it's a tempting scenario. Whether it's actually a coherent scenario would require some quite complex thought. I think there's a book by Andrei Kukla called Ineffability, which touches on these issues a bit. So that might be a place to kind of consider following up that, if I recall correctly.
Let me ask about one other thing, and then we'll wrap up. And it's, of course, related to all of these things. I have often in the arts, there's a big debate about art for art's sake, or I'm a truth teller, and I always sort of find this laughable, because I find the people who cloak themselves as truth tellers are often the biggest bullshitters out there. And I say art is about translating the cosmos, or reality, and there is a fundamental difference between reality and truth, and I'll tie this into nothingness in a moment, and that is that it is a reality, as far as we can tell, that Dan Schneider is interviewing Nicholas Waghorn via Skype. 2 hours ago it wasn't true, 2 hours from now it wasn't being true, but right now as I'm speaking to you and it's being recorded, it is true. But if I said Ish Kabibble is interviewing Nicholas Waghorn, just by changing my name, that is not true. But there is I think there's a difference between truth and reality. You have your truth, I have my truth, but there's an underlying reality that doesn't give a damn about Nicholas Waghorn's truth or Dan Schneider's truth. And in a similar vein, I think that nothingness might have a relationship to it. I'm not certain what it might be, but do you think that nothingness plays a role in this idea of truth and or reality?
Well, if to take up your distinction between truth and reality,
In other
is
words,
there?
and let me just clarify. I always say that truth is is a comment upon the greater reality.
Yeah, yeah. So this seems like there's some sort of mileage to be had out of it, right? If you think that there's this kind of greater reality and there are these different truths which are to a certain extent perspectival, then you will, when coming to deal with these limit concepts like nothing, I think it's going to be harder to find agreement, right? Because if you have these kind of different sorts of perspectival truths, and they're kind of answerable in some ways to reality, and I think they have to be answerable in some ways to reality, then it's possible that continued work is going to get your perspective and my perspective closer together. But if the reality that we're talking about is something that is very hard to even work out how to get closer, so we might know from our kind of two perspectives, we might have some kind of common methodology on how to get closer to the reality that is governing our perspectives, and that will bring our perspectives closer together. If it's even harder to work out what the methodology is that's going to get us closer, then it might mean that this idea about perspectival truth is going to mean that, well, it is going to mean that there's not going to be much in the way of convergence there, unless it's by happenstance.
Well, let me wrap up this interview. Let me just ask for both any closing remarks, anything that you'd like to speak about nothingness that I may not have brought up, and then also you had talked about working about some future books, and we just ask you about what you are going to write or what's in your future. So let me just ask first on anything I may have missed or anything you feel is pertinent that you'd like to say about nothingness, and then also about your future projects.
Well, I think we've covered a sort of good range of issues. I think we've covered in various ways, I think, those three questions that I talked about earlier. Why is there something rather than nothing? We've considered, that it might be the case that it's just a brute fact that there's something rather than nothing. So Russell thought that it was just a brute fact that the universe existed. In his own way, Richard Swinburne thinks that it's a contingent fact that can't be any further explained that God exists. Yeah. And there's obviously, those are two very different views. One's a theistic view, one's an atheistic view, but those are understandings of why there might be something rather than nothing. We've considered the question about whether there could have been nothing. I mean, that would answer the question, why is there something rather than nothing, very easily, if it just couldn't be the case that there is nothing. And so we talked a bit about that with regard to, well, is there a necessary being, namely God? That depends on whether there's a working version of the ontological argument. You might also say that there has to be, it's necessary that there be some being or other, even though there's no one being that it's necessary that there be. So you might say you can give a kind of ontological argument for something existing, even if you can't give an ontological argument for some one thing existing. Mm. And so some people like Jonathan Lowe, E.J. Lowe, or Bede Rundle have tried to advance those sorts of arguments. And then there's the I think there's the deeper question about what is nothing, and that strikes me as a very interesting but a very difficult question, and that's what I'm trying to wrestle with, and I think we wrestled with that interestingly in the beginning. It's notable perhaps that given that we talked about how nothing might be interdefinable with the notion of something and the notion of everything, that both those notions, something and everything, or thing and everything, are very difficult to understand themselves. So everything, there's been a recent spate of work on the notion of unrestricted quantification. Can you quantify everything? Can you talk about everything? And there are various reasons to think that you can't do that, that trying to do so might lead you into problems with set theoretic paradoxes like Russell's paradox. But I won't go into that in any great detail. There's a good book by Augustin Reo and Gabriel Osquiana called Absolute Generality, where that's talked about in a lot of technical detail.
And before, let me just pick up on this one thing you said. And does that the things you just mentioned, does that make a moot question of the ultimate question of why? I mean, is why something because science is about the how things did it, where it happened, and whatnot. Is why, in a sense, the ultimate moot question? Because we could talk if we believe that there was a Big Bang, or even if the universe is infinite, it becomes kind of a silly question almost.
I wouldn't necessarily want to say it's a silly question because that's going to mean I do myself out of a job as a philosopher, because these are the very kind of philosophical questions we ask. I don't think that so there are different views.
But do we end up hitting a wall where there's just no further play? It's a just because answer. Why is it this way? That's just the way it is.
Well, that would be the brute fact answer.
Yeah.
Why is there something rather than nothing? It's just a brute fact.
Yeah.
You could do that, right? So the reason why people have wanted to avoid doing that, or historically why people have wanted to avoid doing that, is because they believed in something like the principle of sufficient reason, which says that for every fact there's a sufficient reason. So maybe for every true proposition, or for every fact maybe, there is a sufficient reason why it's so and not otherwise. Now, that's a very strong explanatory principle, and a lot of people have wanted to reject it because they think it leads to strange results, like everything being necessary or something like that. But at the same time, it's also very attractive. As soon as you start admitting exceptions, like, okay, this thing can be a brute fact, then you might say, well, why shouldn't we admit more of these exceptions? And you might say, well, we should just try to explain things as far as we can. But that seems to be a kind of a practical suggestion rather than something that's truly principled. So, I mean, there are all sorts of problems with the strong principle of sufficient reason. I'm quite sympathetic towards it myself, although I don't acknowledge the problems. I'm a little bit. I just find the idea that there are just these kind of brute facts a bit dissatisfying. Now, there's no reason why the universe should conform to what's going to satisfy me, but it doesn't strike me as kind of wholly sort of intellectually satisfying just to say, okay, well, it's just a brute fact. I think we should try and look for explanations as far as we possibly, or try to look for satisfying intellectual explanations.
And is that something that you're going to be working on in the future, or what is your next project?
Well, I suppose the problem is that trying to look for these intellectual explanations as far as possible has just led me into this kind of morass, and so people who reject the principle of sufficient reason are going to say, well, look at the state you've ended up in, and point to me as this kind of cautionary tale, as someone who's just getting bogged down in unanswerable questions. I guess maybe that's something I quite like. Don't quite like being bogged down, but I think I'm going to try and get bogged down in a different area. I'm going to do some interdisciplinary being bogged down, or at least being bogged down in a different area of philosophy. So as I say, I'm hopefully going to try and work on death next, and apply some of the phenomenological the notion of nothing as a phenomenological concept to the debate surrounding what death might be and whether we should be worried about it. But I'm at a very, very preliminary stage at that on that at the moment.
And I guess just one final brief question. I guess if you could have one question answered, and let's just keep it, I guess, about the idea of nothingness. What is the one thing that, let's say, in your lifetime, if there could be some kind of a proof given about something, either by yourself or a colleague, what is that thing you would want to know or learn or have elucidated?
Is this about anything at all, or just about?
Let's do nothing and then everything outside of nothing. Nothing.
Do nothing first and then everything later. Yeah. Okay. So I suppose with nothing, I'd just like to know what on earth it is, even though talking about it is a mistake. So some clarity on the concept would be nice. I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. I'd be amazed if it does, but then I'm open, things can always surprise you. And then a general kind of philosophical question, maybe an answer to the question about how we even go about doing philosophy. I think the issue of philosophical methodology is another issue that's becoming increasingly popular, and that increasing amount of work is being done. And that's another area that I'm interested in going to do research in. So some answers to the question about how we even go about doing philosophy, or what is the best way or the correct way of doing philosophy, would be an interesting one to me. That's probably vague and overgeneral, and from some mischievous genie would get some deliberately unhelpful answer, but that's what I've come up with on the spur of the moment.
Well, I was going to end there, but you brought up a point, so I just wanted to ask. It's generally conceded, and I've done these trilogies on 8 or 9 different topics where I have a theological person, philosophical, and science. And generally speaking, it's accepted, I think, that most people say religion came first, then philosophy sort of branched off from religion, and then natural philosophy, science branched off from philosophy. Do you think that it's possible that in the future, that instead of having these 3 major ways of looking at the world, that there could be a 4th way that branches off from science, say, and maybe incorporates some of the elements of the other 2, philosophy and religion, in the future?
It's interesting. I mean, maybe that sort of thing might come about. Arguably, some areas of science are doing that already. So the very early cosmology, or stuff about the beginning of the universe, some people have complained about for being too ungrounded in observation and too much like philosophy.
Right.
So maybe there's this going to be a kind of circling back. I mean, certainly I think it's true in Eastern traditions that generally philosophy and religion are less distinct.
And for example, ideas of a multiverse, multiple universes, we may not be able to ever have physical proof.
Certainly certain views of the multiverse. So I think Tegmark's understanding of the multiverse, which seems to be quite close to the idea of philosopher David Lewis, it's quite hard to see how you might be able to have evidence for that. I'm by no means a physicist or very knowledgeable about that, but
Well, I want to thank Nicholas for spending an hour or so speaking. I will link to his university page, and I'll also look up and link to maybe one of the Amazon pages for his books. So thank you for spending some time speaking with me.
It's been a real pleasure. Thanks very much indeed for getting in touch and for asking such interesting questions. Thank you.